Good day to you. And how social of a person are you? Do you have to get together with everybody all the time when they're getting together, like a Friday night? Do you feel left out if you're not the person who's there and it seems like all your friends are there getting together with everybody? Are you a person who communicates regularly with people throughout the day? Do you have to speak to people, otherwise you start to feel lonely? And how do you speak to them in terms of the way that you speak? Do you use technology or do you meet them in person? Are you a person that feels you have to be around people, even if you're not doing a lot of talking, you're just around others so that you can see other people, other human beings moving around? What is it about you that is social? Well, I purposely left a lot of those questions very vague because defining what sociology is very, very difficult. And that's why we have a whole chapter today, chapter 2, asking, are social media social? Right? We use that term all the time, social media. But are media truly social? Do they get us together in ways that define us as being social? Because we use that term, we might as well know if social media fit that term. So that's what we're taking on today. We're taking on definitions of social media. And once again, we're going to find ourselves going through many terms that seem similar, many terms that are overlapping with each other. That's the nature of the study of social media from a political and economic standpoint. And that's what we're doing in this class, please remember. So we're going to take a look today at sociological theory and the field of sociology. Yeah, the field of sociology is the field that best answers the question of whether social media, are in fact social. And so most of the people you see cited today are sociologists or sociological researchers. And this term Web.2 is used quite a book in the chapter. You'll read about that, as is Web.1, as is Web.3. Okay, that was an original term. Originally, I should say, that was derived from Tim O'Reilly's book. And he was writing a book on the development of social media. And he argued that social media are presenting new conditions for people today, including the decentralization, the radicalization of trust, meaning blind trust in a medium taking care of you, and participation by people who are also producing the content. Now, there's a lot of other terms that go along with Web 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, but we're talking about Web 2.0 right now, and these are just some of the key features. It's the idea that computer networking is a platform where other people can join in and cooperate with each other. But what happened to Web.2 to 2.0, which is around the year of the millennial turn of the century, 2000, that's when Web 2.0 was being discussed, is there was a crash. There was a crash in the economy. In the 2000s, it was accelerated in 2007, 2008. This book will refer to it many times, not as a crash, but as a crisis of capitalism. But it was a time period where many people were out of work. Property values fell. The stock market lost value. I can remember we called it a recession in those years, a very deep recession in those years. And the effect on the internet world was it bankrupted internet companies. It bankrupted them and they lost all of their values. They had to reinvent themselves to come back. And we're going to be discussing that later in the book. And that's Web 3.0. That's after these crashes in 2007, 2.0. We're in Web 3.0 right now. But right now we're talking about Web 2.0 in terms of trying to define social media, because Web 2.0 is when social media came of age. You have, generally speaking, the internet is growing in the 1970s, takes off in the 1980s with email. In the 1990s, you start to get web pages, and then in the 2000s, you get social media, the Instagrams, which comes along later, but Facebook, Twitter, and now TikTok. So this is Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And so now we're going to raise some questions throughout our talk today. And the first one we're going to ask for is, how new are social media? Have they been around just like I talked about in recent times, or is there evidence that we have had social media from a long time ago? And you'll actually find two definitions under this section. One says, yeah, we had social media back with the Romans, because the Romans used to write letters and then everyone would sit around and comment on the letters, right? That's what we consider to be a key feature of social media today. So you can say that social media are as old as the Romans itself, but probably most people would say that social media became social media in the 1990s. The 1990s is when we first get the blog. The blog is where you can make a weblog. Remember, that's the short term for web log is blog. And it's where you can basically keep your diary online for others to see and comment on. And that's the key for social media, at least at this early stage in our understanding of it. So in essence, social media have been around recently, since the 1990s, but you can find roots of them back to the Romans. Now let's talk about let's talk about media and social theory now. So when we think of media, sometimes it's easy to just think of media as a piece of technology, like a computer or a laptop, the same thing, but also different, or a radio receiver in your car, or a monitor on your screen that's bringing in TV or streaming Netflix. We tend to think of technology as being the basis of media. But in fact, media organizes socially. They bring us together in ways and also start to constrict how we can behave and also enable how we can behave. When you come together on Facebook, if you start to say something that is related to the pandemic that is considered untrue, Facebook will censor that, or it will put a piece of information in there saying, click here to go for COVID information. And so that's going to then affect the way that people post about COVID on Facebook. And so technology, the ability to go on your computer and go on Facebook, is not just that act in and of itself. It's also starting to organize you and the way that you act. And so we have both the medium and the outcome as being part of the same process. And we're going to introduce a term here now that is not yet introduced by Christian Fuchs, but we certainly will be introducing it because it goes right along with social media. And that term is the prosumer. The prosumer, a unique term that describes an internet user. Because when you are an internet user, you are both using the medium and you are creating the outcome of that medium. You are both the medium and the outcome when you're an internet user because you are generating the content. All of the content on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, that doesn't come from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. It comes from people like you and me typing sports scores or putting photos on there or making comments or whatever you're doing, whatever literally you're doing, you are putting on the web, and it is being sold by the company that is getting access to your information. It could be Facebook, could be Amazon, could be Google. So you are both at the same time when you're using the web, a producer, you're producing content, and you are also a consumer. You're the person who's sitting there looking at the photos, sharing the photos, making comments, liking things. So you are both a producer and a consumer, or a prosumer. And that's a very unique feature of the internet age and also of social media. Let's go on now to talk about some of these sociologists that I mentioned earlier. We've got Emil Durkheim, an early sociologist, and he's asked the question about the social and social facts, because that's part of defining whether social media are social, is do they address this concept of social facts? And what he's talking about is once something makes it into social media, it becomes a social fact by virtue of other people observing that information. So for example, I was on Facebook this morning and somebody made the post. I think it was one of those anonymous posts, which means right away you have to ask whether it's a bot, a Russian bot, or whether there's a commercial interest behind posting something that contains some kind of natural supplement that they want you to purchase. You have to ask these questions when you just see sponsored spots or anonymous posts come up on Facebook. And this particular one said, did you know that after the Holocaust, that survivors who wore the pink ribbon for breast cancer were put back into the concentration camps and were released at a later date? Now that's going all over the internet. I know it is. If it appeared in my feed, it's going in feeds of all kinds of other people. Is it true or not? I don't know. I purposely didn't research that before I wanted to mention it in my class this morning. Because right now, I could treat that as a social fact. I could say this is a fact, that people who had the pink ribbon were put back into confinement and extermination. That's essentially what it's saying. And is it true or not? I don't know, but it's just become a social fact, because other people are going to think of that as fact. So what happens, Durkheim says, is that the internet objectifies information, and it objectifies our social relations. When something becomes fact, we assume it to be true. We don't know for sure. We assume it to be unless otherwise proven. Then it has become a social fact, and that's what social media do all the time. Another sociologist to talk about terms having to do with whether something is social is Tanis. Tanis, he talked about the social as communal. So there are differences between being social, which is communicating with people, many people, but communal is where you come together to solve problems. You come together to have similar ideas. You come together to find agreement and disagreement to some extent, but more so agreement with others because they share your same outlook. And that's what happens on the internet. People come together. They start to there's a lot of people talking about the NFL games this morning, about what went wrong for the San Francisco 49ers, for example. They're talking about that. They're talking about what went wrong for the Chiefs. And so you have communities of people who have come together and they're now discussing and problem solving. And the workers are working together. Think of them as workers. And that's what you're doing when you're talking about the NFL, because everybody who is in the business of mining users of social media who might purchase something related to the NFL, they're looking for people like you on the internet. They're trying to find people who are commenting on the Kansas City Chiefs or anything having to do with the NFL. They're going to mine you for more information and for more data so it can be sold. So therefore, we get to Marx. And Marx is very much into talking about cooperation as well. But Marx, remember, he's the chief thinker in this whole class that we're going to be studying, Karl Marx, and we already introduced him last chapter. He's talking a lot about industrialization because he was living during the 18th century when industrialization took place in Europe and also taking place in the United States. And Marx was asking the question, if the workers can participate in making this company rich, if they're in that factory every day and they are producing pistons for a car. Actually, the car didn't come along until about 30 years later. But if you've got a factory situation where the workers are producing pistons for cars like they do in Detroit, they're cooperating on Detroit's enterprise to make money, or GM's enterprise or Ford's enterprise. Therefore, should the workers not also be included in the cooperative in terms of owning the means of production? That's a very Marxian term. Not owning the company, not owning production, but owning the means to production. That means the wealth and the capital, the stock, the financing, the cold hard cash. Can they also participate in that to own part of the means of producing the pistons? And that's the basis for Marx. And he's saying that's what should be studied in terms of social media too. Shouldn't you, as a person who's making Facebook up to $80 billion, that's what it made 2 years ago anyway, $80 billion, should you be a person that shares in that? If you're using Facebook every day, that's what we're going to look at. So right now, we would say Facebook is not social from that Marxian point of view, from that particular Marxian point of view, and that, no, we're not cooperating with each other in the sense that we're sharing in the profits, that's for sure. Now let's go on to the next item, which is explaining social media. You think that's what we've been doing so far, right? No, that's what Fuchs does in his writing. Every time you think, that you've reached the end of a certain concept, you've taken it as far as you can take it, next comes just one more layer, and that's what he's doing, explaining social media. So he says that social media provide knowledge, and knowledge itself consists of cognition, which is the thinking part. Anytime you hear that word cognition, it means the brain. Cognition is one part of what constitutes knowledge. Communication is a second part because that cognition has to be communicated with others. I'm talking to you right now on YouTube. The book is talking to you by you reading the book. You may talk to another student in the class if you're in a group chat today about some of the material. So communication is also part of knowledge, as is cognition. And then lastly, we have cooperation. There's that term again, cooperation. We have to agree. We have to agree that something is fact or something is valid, right? And we couldn't agree right now whether or not pink ribbons, because of the way I set it up, we can't agree whether people with pink ribbons were actually put back in the Holocaust. I'm gonna look it up, and I'm gonna look at my sources after this so that I'm in the know, and I hope you do too. But cooperation is where we agree on what we're going to agree on in essence. So another way to look at social media is it's got integration, communication, and cooperation. So you have these three things going on together. this is the place where it happens. The cooperation doesn't happen just on the playground. The communication doesn't just happen with the lunch that your mother puts in a lunchbox. It's happening on the web. It's happening through this YouTube video and likes and shares and everything else that people do on the web. So that's why we have the development of so many versions of Web 1.0, Web 2.0, and Web 3.0, which we're into now. We're going to come back and visit that. They're critical concepts. When you hear that, it's not just kind of like saying this is another release of an Apple iPhone, like Apple 9, Apple 10, Apple 11X, or whatever. It's not like saying that. It's saying this is a new way of analyzing the web. Web 2.0 is one way of looking at it, with this cooperation, people coming together and starting to make money for companies and becoming prosumers. And now we're in 3.0, which is different. And it's going to take more of the semester to figure that out. But you can look at the top websites in the book. Isn't that not fascinating? How Christian Fuchs, you'll get more of that in this chapter. He lists the most popular websites visited. You can see a lot of your favorites there. And then he discusses, what are they? Are they information providers? Do they connect people to communicate? What are they mostly? What is Yahoo mostly doing? What is YouTube mostly doing? You can read that section of the chapter and find out. Next up is talking about a model of social media communities. What would that look like, a model of social media communities? We've all been in them. Last year from the pandemic, we're going to talk about the pandemic in a moment. Christian Fuchs addresses that in his book. It's one of the reasons that I got this version of the book. But for now, we can address the idea of models of media communities. What does that look like? What does it look like where we have integrated sociality? If you want to think of it that way, that we're asking that term, right? Are media social today? That's what we're trying to ask. Integrated sociality, according to sociologists, let's not forget, we're citing sociologists today. Integrated sociology includes cooperation. Yeah, we've got a lot of cooperation going on. It includes communication, and it includes cognition. So the thinking process, people coming together into groups, and then once they're together in those groups, working together to produce a result that is common to the group. That's what integrated sociality is, and we can certainly find that in social media. What about integrated social roles? Here's all these terms, integrated social roles now. Well, yeah, there's that too. What it means is we have very specific roles. The way that the media and social media structure our communication develops those roles. And we know who we are, but sometimes those roles are integrated. So you know very clearly when you go into McDonald's, who is the employee and who is the customer? You're the customer, right? You're not an employee. I saw a funny TikTok a couple days ago where a guy waited too long at the Waffle House. Did you see this one going around? Waited too long at the Waffle House for his waffle, so he just got up and walked behind and made himself, it looked like he was making himself some scrambled eggs or an omelet or something, but he just went back there with no uniform on, and people are like, well, he's a regular. That points out, right? We know very clearly what we're supposed to do in a place like that. We are clearly not an employee. But on the web, that's getting all confused. You are, in fact, not really an employee, but you're acting like one every time you go on the web because your information from your prosuming is being sold. It's called big data. That's what you're doing. Every keystroke, there goes another piece of data, a datum that is being collected and sold by Facebook and Google and Amazon to Nike and Geico and all the rest of those businesses out there that are mining for that information. Speaking of the COVID crisis, Fuchs does address that, and he says, obviously, what we already know. You're living in a time period, right, where you're going to be studying that time period later and looking back. What really happened to us as human beings during the pandemic? We're not there yet. We're still in it, right? I myself have had COVID. A lot of people have been affected, profoundly affected by this horrific disease, and a lot of people, quite frankly, don't believe it's real. A lot of people believe it's a hoax, and that's also part of what Christian Fuchs talks about. He talks about changes in sociality that have been mediated by the pandemic. I went for a walk the other day and I recognized a person. I went over to talk to her. She was with somebody who I didn't know, and she introduced me to him, and I went to give him a fist pump, and he just stood there. And she said he doesn't do that. And I mean, oh my God, that's so complex, that whole thing. I'm trying to think, why doesn't he do that? What was he offended? Does he not want to touch anybody? Does he think it's silly? I never found out. But the whole idea of the way that we, I guess, introduce ourselves has been fundamentally changed. Like during the pandemic, CNN was saying, will the handshake ever come back? Now, people are shaking hands again. Maybe that's going to be the ultimate symbol of when the pandemic is over, when people freely shake hands again. But right now, people are still doing a lot of fist pumps, and some people aren't touching, some people aren't getting in close quarters at all. That's all been created for us by the media, how we're supposed to act. And so the COVID crisis has changed our sociality. It has changed our idea of how we get together with others. Many of us were virtually in solitary confinement for an entire year, myself included, during the pandemic when we were online. I was even in quarantine from my own family at times, and I'm sure there are people in this class that had similar situations. As I mentioned, though, we have a lot of fake news going around, a lot of information about the pandemic that's just not true. People have different belief systems, so they're certainly entitled to have those belief systems about things like vaccination and wearing masks. But you'll also ask, at what point do they have a responsibility to others in the public that if they are communicating that disease, that they have to get a vaccine? That question is very difficult, frankly, to answer. And I just have to say for myself at a personal level, prior to me catching COVID, in which I almost died in September, I had perceived a vaccination kind of like abortion. I felt it was the woman's right to choose, as it is for abortion. I feel that it would have been the person's right to choose for vaccination. But after having died and contracted it, I'm almost positive, I can't know for sure, from a young daughter, 6 years old, of a woman mother who proclaims herself an anti-vaxxer. That's a term that has grown up in social media. I got COVID and nearly died. So my experience changed me. And the way that this has been talked about on social media has led me down this path of reasoning. And so you all have your own very personal and different experiences as well. But we know for a fact that during COVID, people avoided face-to-face contact. The COVID crisis, as it's called, completely changed the way that we communicate and our very engagement in sociality and our use of social media, quite frankly. And Zoom was a big part of it. All of us in the college setting know Zoom real well. A lot of people really just hate Zoom. They're, no more Zoom, please, no more Zoom. I hope that my videos don't come across like a Zoom. I certainly understand Zoom fatigue. And what Fuchs wants to point out, though, is that during this coronavirus, and it's still going on, digital companies, digital corporations, monster digital corporations have really profited from the coronavirus pandemic. You know, for the Pfizers, the Modernas of the world, the Zooms of the world, you know, virtually any piece of technology that took advantage of the web, such as Netflix, really positioned itself well by starting to really ramping up its own productions of content, original content. And of course, Netflix is shared on social media. So let's not forget that, you know, in the midst of all these tragedies and troubles happening, that there is something going on that's really big with technology companies making a lot of money, and including vaccination companies from the virus, and social media is facilitating that. And so this takes us now to COVID news and fake news, to try and hone in on where news is fake and also has to be COVID fake to be considered under this category at the end of Fuchs' chapter. But he does talk about Bill Gates. You all know Bill Gates, I hope. He's the founder of the Microsoft Corporation and the software platform DOS. And that itself has releases 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, the basic operating system, Microsoft computers. So he's developed a wealthy empire, just like a lot of upstart internet people have done. Mark Zuckerberg is another one. Jeff Bezos is another one for Amazon. You know, they have an idea on the web, and they become the only idea after a while, and they consume the whole market. Yeah, they're actually consuming a market if you think of it that way. But Bill Gates, early on, there was a rumor going around that Bill Gates had invented the coronavirus in a lab through his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the reason he did this is because he wanted every human being to have a computer chip put in them to trace where they are because of the coronavirus pandemic. And that would, of course, accelerate Bill Gates's Microsoft global profit-making empire. But not so fast. He doesn't even make computer chips. That's the Excel company that does that, along with others. Celeron is another one. You know, but this was a fake news conspiracy that went around. Later on, he researched in the media as somebody speaking on behalf of the coronavirus as an expert. In fact, he was most recently quoted as saying the Omicron phase is going to pass, and then the coronavirus pandemic will hopefully subside. That's what Bill Gates said. So he's made a comeback in the media, so to speak. But conspiracies are a big part of fake news. And Fuchs makes the point that conspiracies tend to become more popular in times of uncertainty. Now, one could argue, myself included, I'm almost 60 years old, I've seen quite a few things in the world, that there's always uncertainty. There's always uncertainty. When I lived in California, there was always the uncertainty of whether there was going to be an earthquake on those two fault lines that were right outside of my office at Cal State San Bernardino. There's always uncertainty whether there was more during a pandemic or a housing crisis or a stock market collapse or any of the other things that have had long-term effect, wars, certainly. That's when you start to get conspiracy theories, and he wants to make that point. And that's where a lot of, I guess he's saying the motivation for fake news about COVID is from uncertainty, and social media allows it to spread. Social media passes it around. Social media can turn a statement and make it a social fact without people really spending the time to examine the source of that statement and doing their own independent research to find out whether it's true. Now, we hope our students who graduate not only from the Department of Communication, but from East Stroudsburg University in general, that they are practicing it. That's part of getting a bachelor's degree, is that you're going to be a discernible, I'm not going to even say consumer, you're going to be a discernible critic. When you get out into the world, you're going to be able to look at information as so-called social fact and really discover whether it's news, and if not, correct that with others who speak about it. But that's a larger concern for you beyond today's class, which is all about asking whether social media are social. So are they?